Now we're ready to start. Good afternoon, dear colleagues and guests. Today is August the 30th, 2021, 3 p.m. Moscow time. Allow the meeting of the Dissertation Council on the defense of the thesis Chernoglazov Dmitrii Alexandrovich for an academic degree, Doctor of Philology in Scientific Major 100214 Classical Philology, Byzantine and Modern Greek Philology, on topic treatise Epistolary styles, Pseudo-Libanios and his later version, Byzantine writers and their practical application. Consider open. By order of the Academic Secretary, St. Petersburg State University, Alexander Gnyotov, dated April 16, 2021, number 3569/1, I, Mikhail Poznov, Doctor of Philology, Professor of the Department of Classical Philology, St. Petersburg State University, was appointed Chairman of the Dissertation Council. The same order approved the members of the Dissertation Council. Let me introduce them. In the remote access mode are the following members: Afanasieva Tatiana, Doctor of Philology, Professor of the Department of Russian Language in Petersburg State University. Can you see and hear us? Positive. Next, Tatiana Universitetskaya, Doctor of Philology, Professor of the Department of Russian Language in Petersburg State University. Can you hear and see us? The answer is positive. Tatiana Kush, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Associate Professor, Head of the Department of the History of the Ancient World and the Middle Ages of the Ural Federal University, named after the first President of Russia, Yeltsin. Can you see and hear us? The answer is positive. Thank you. Mikhail Grunwald, PhD, Professor, University of Westphalia, Germany. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, everything is fine, yeah.
Thank you. The applicant is also present with us. That is Dmitrii Chernoglazov. Well, in order to improve the quality of communication, I ask you, dear colleagues, when in remote access mode, turn off your microphones. But do not forget to turn them on when you're given the floor. I would also like to inform you that audio and visual recording of our meeting is being conducted and live broadcast on St. Petersburg State University website is conducted, and simultaneous translation is provided. On the screen of live broadcast of the meeting of the station, currently there is an email. This is the email address to which during the meeting all listeners can send questions to the applicant or express their opinion concerning the content of the thesis or the applicant's speech. Well, this applies to the guests. Thus, you can take part in the scientific discussion. The technical services will send the questions to me, and I will voice them during the time for discussion. And the questions should be directly related to the speech of the applicant and the content of the thesis. And it's obligatory to indicate the full name, position, place of work of the author of the question. Any other questions which are not related to the scientific discussion, to the thesis, and to the applicant's speech, as well as anonymous questions, will not be voiced. In accordance with the order of awarding of scientific degrees of Candidate of Sciences and Doctor of Sciences approved by local regulation of St. Petersburg State University. Hereinafter the procedure. The meeting of the Decision Council is considered competent if at least 2/3 of the approved composition of the Decision Council, but not less than 4 people, take place in it. Our Decision Council consists of 5 people, and all 5 are present, including 4 members of the Council in a remote access mode. Audiovisual contact is provided. Thus, there is a quorum. And I'd like the Officer of the Department supporting the activities of the Decision Council to issue a turnout list. I'm establishing the following timetable for today's meeting of the Decision Council with a total duration of approximately 2 hours. First, a brief information of the chairman about the applicant and documents submitted by the applicant for a scientific degree and their compliance with established requirements. And answer to possible questions, about 5 minutes. Next. A short presentation of the applicant for a scientific degree reflecting the main provisions for defense, about 20 minutes. Try to stick to the timetable. Then answers of the applicant, no more than 5 minutes. Follow with the questions of the participants. The next step, the speeches of all members of the Decision Council, alternately with the assessment of the thesis and performance of the applicant. 10 minutes per person. Next, the speech by the chairman, about 10 minutes. Then we proceed with the answers of the applicant to the questions and comments of the members of the Decision Council. My question is, will you answer to the questions all together, or you would like to provide your answers to each questions separately? The applicant chooses to answer all the questions after all the members of the council take the floor. Then we proceed with open discussion, presentation at the request of those present on the defense. So it is possible for the guest to ask questions and to provide comments strictly on the topic of the research. And I'd like our guests to be brief as well. You have no more than 2 minutes per person. And it's necessary for all those willing to ask questions or provide comments from guests to list your name in the turnout form. Next, I will voice the questions received via email. The questions that will be received during the live broadcast. These are written questions, and they are to be rather concise. For if a question requires a lengthy answer, then the question will not be voiced. So you don't ask anything on the global scale. And then we move on to the answers of the applicant. Then the members of the Decision Council, before the open roll call, might have a discussion for about 5 minutes with muted sound. So if necessary, the colleagues will be able to discuss the results of the defense, if necessary again. Then we'll proceed with open roll call, vote count, with subsequent entry of the results in the minutes of the meeting, and making a decision on awarding or non-awarding of the scientific degree, and then concluding remarks of the applicant. Dear colleagues, are there any questions or objections to the regulations, to the procedure? Since there are none, we will move on to the implementation of the procedure of the meeting. Please, first of all, turn off the sound of your mobile phones, since it might be a very serious obstacle to the meeting. But a very important remark, dear colleagues in the remote access mode, please do not turn off your mobile phones, for in need of communication, in the event of technical failure, we'll be able to contact you via your mobile phone. Thank you for your understanding. So we're starting the meeting. We start with the chairman's brief report. The thesis by Dmitrii A. Chernoglazov, scientific degree, Doctor of Philosophy in Philology in scientific major, classical philology, Byzantine, modern Greek philology, and the topic, the treatise Epistolary of Pseudo-Libanios and its later version, Byzantine letter writing manuals and their practical use, adopted for defense by the order of the Academic Secretaries of Petersburg State University by order 15041. Dmitrii Chernoglazov wrote the thesis research on the basis of St. Petersburg State University. The number of publications by the applicant that outline the main scientific results of the research, according to the presented list, 16 work. In peer-reviewed scientific publication from the list approved by the Ministry of Education and Science of the Russian Federation, 12. In publication listed in the Scientific Databases of Web Sciences Corpus, 4. The applicant presented the full package to the scientific secretaries in St. Petersburg State University, and all the documents correspond to the procedure. All the documents submitted by the applicant, according to the information received by me from the curator, meet the requirements and are stored in the station file of the applicant. The member of the department also has copies of them to ensure the activities of the Station Council, which is now present in the meeting. Before giving the floor to the applicant, I have a question to the members of the Station Council. Dear members of the Station Council, are there any general questions for the applicant, including whether there is a need to announce the entire list of documents submitted by the applicant for defense? In such a case, we give the floor to the applicant. Dmitrii Alexandrovich, the floor is yours. Dear members of the Station Council, dear guests, Epistolary Styles of Pseudo-Libanios Pseudo-Proclus is an early Byzantine treatise on the art of writing letters. This is a short text that defines writing, provides general guidelines for epistolary style, and identifies 41 types of letters. For each type, there is a definition and short example. The types of letters are classified based on their purpose and content: friendly, pleading, congratulatory, abusive, love, etc. In the manuscripts, the treatise is mistakenly attributed either to the Antiochian rhetorician Libanius or to philosopher Neoplatonist Proclus. Thus it's called Pseudo-Libanios Pseudo-Proclus. The treatise was widely disseminated both in Byzantium and abroad. It was read, copied, commented on throughout the Byzantine era. On its basis, new Greek writing manuals were created. It was translated into Latin in Renaissance Italy and significantly influenced the development of Western European writing theory. In the thesis, the following tasks were set: to investigate epistolary styles and related treatises in terms of their dating, content, sources, and style; to identify the functions of the treatise to determine their relationship with epistolary practice and their place in the educational process; to prepare a critical edition of one of the treatises, akin to epistolary styles of the late Byzantine writer, 40 types of letters, which has not yet been fully published. And finally, to trace the evolution of Byzantine epistolary theory and characterize its influence on the development of the theory of writing in Greece during the Ottoman period and in Western Europe during the Renaissance period. To achieve the above-mentioned goals, a number of tasks were set. First of all, to identify all the writing manuals related to the epistolary styles, characterize their relationship with each other, analyze the text from the point of view of their handwritten tradition, to determine the sources of the writing manuals and describe the methods of their processing, to reveal in exemplary letters the adequate formulas and cliché common in Byzantine and post-Byzantine epistolary practice, to compare writers belonging to the Byzantine tradition with Western European and early Greek treatises. The methods of solving these problems imply, first of all, a comprehensive philological analysis of texts, including a number of aspects: paleographic, textological, linguistic, literary, and historical aspects. To define the functions of treatise, the thesis examines in detail the handwritten tradition, with attention paid to both scholias accompanying the text and its contexts in the manuscripts. The convoy of the treatise may indicate how it was used and for which audience it was intended. Exemplary letters are analysed in the broad context of epistolary practice. Define formulas and motifs uniting writing materials and genuine correspondence. Thus, the material from the Thesaurus Lingua Graeca computer database is used, G, which currently includes most of the Byzantine and a significant number of early Greek letters. Also, continuous reading of a number of epistolary collections also used, especially those that were themselves widespread in Byzantium and served as examples of the epistolary style. For example, the letters of Basil the Great and essays of Cyrene, Mikhail Psella, and others. To date, the topic of the thesis has been developed very little. A review of the literature on the topics of interest allows us to reveal the following trends. Studies of the Greek epistolary theory were mainly limited to the ancient and early Byzantine period, that is up to the 4th or 6th century. There were no special studies on the Byzantine theory of writing. The original text of epistolary styles were studied in connection with the era in which it was written, primarily in the context of early Byzantine epistolary practice. The question of the further fate of the treatise, about its existence, for example, in late Byzantium or in Renaissance Europe in the 16th century, was not put in science. Later treatises akin to the epistolary styles created from the era of Macedonian Renaissance to the 18th century haven't been studied at all, and some haven't been published and not introduced into scientific circulation. With the exception of a single article of 1909, epistolary styles and later versions were never considered as a whole. As part of a single tradition that developed over 1,000 years and reflected the evolution of Byzantine and early Greek epistolary theory. The above-mentioned trends indicate the scientific novelty of the thesis. It takes into account all the treatises known to us that are related to the epistolary styles, reveals the relationship between them, traces the evolution of the entire tradition, and determines the function of each writing manual, not only in the period when it rose, but throughout the whole history of its existence in Byzantium and outside its spatial and time framework. The research undertaken within the framework of the thesis seems to be very relevant in the context of modern science. In recent decades, Byzantine and early New Greek epistolography has invariably remained in the center of attention of scholars. Critical editions of texts are published, reference and generalizing works are published, allowing much better orientation in the huge corpus of medieval Greek letters. And with such successes in the study of epistolary practice, the study of theoretical guidelines and their role in the educational process looks more than relevant. And these theoretic guidelines, up to now, have remained outside the scope of science. The thesis consists of an introduction, 7 chapters, a conclusion, bibliography, and 2 appendices. In the introduction, the goals, objectives, and methods of research are formulated and stated. The overview of scientific literature and the topic of the thesis is given. Chapter 1, Epistolary Theory in Byzantium, outlines the Greek theory of writing of the Byzantine period in general, identifies its specific features, and develops a genre classification of its sources. Chapter 2, Pseudo-Libanios and Pseudo-Proclus, analyzes the original version of the treatise, PL1, that is. Such aspects are the handwritten tradition, the identity of the author, dating, sources, style, and functions are taken into consideration. They all relate primarily to the late Byzantine era. In chapter 3, PL2, Macedonian Pseudo-Libanios, and chapter 4, PL3, 40 types of letter, 2 main Byzantine versions of the treatise are considered. The first belongs to the Macedonian era, hence the name, and the second to the era of the communes. For each of the same aspects, for each of the texts, the same aspects are taken into consideration as for PL1. Chapter 5, Pseudo-Libanios in the era of Ottoman dominion, examines the early Greek adaptation of 40 types of letters. Metaphrase, that is the translation of the lex in the simplified language. Modern Greek translation made from metaphrase, and the writer of Nicodemus, the Holy Mountain. All 3 texts are also subjected to a comprehensive philological analysis and are compared with the writing manuals of the new type, of the new era, the treatise of Theophilus Kyridelevs, 17th century, for example, and others. Chapter 6, Textbook for Secondary School, analyzes a treatise that arose on the basis of epistolary styles, presumably in the late Byzantine era, and intended, according to the contents, for studying grammar at school. Chapter 7, Pseudo-Libanios in Western Europe, analyzes the mechanisms of reception of Pseudo-Libanios in Western European epistolary theory. Attention is focused on the Latin translation of the treatise, the methods of work of translators, and the purpose of their works are taken into consideration. The conclusion summarizes the research results. Appendix 1 contains a critical edition, 40 types of letters, with Russian translation and English translation, respectively. Appendix 2 contains a selective edition of the 14th century 40 types and metaphors, that is the simplified version, and its early modern Greek translation. The modern Greek text is accompanied by a Russian and English translation as well. The critical edition of 40 types of letters, that's Appendix 1, is being carried out for the first time. The edition is based on 24 manuscripts, dating back to the 13th to 19th centuries. The relationship between the manuscript was revealed and standard was built. The incomplete edition of the literary masterpiece was also taken into consideration. The Greek text is accompanied by the most detailed critical apparatus and apparatus of sources. Let's move on to the main conclusions of the research. The early Byzantine treatise, epistolary style, Pseudo-Libanios, late 4th, early 5th centuries, laid the foundation for an extensive tradition of Greek writing manuals, which continuously existed and developed until the 18th century. Treatises related to the tradition play a central role in Byzantine epistolary theory. 2. Epistolary styles, Pseudo-Libania, were used in Byzantium as a school textbook. Model letters served as material both for grammar analysis and for simplest rhetorical exercises, which involved the amplification of short samples, but their expansion with the help of rhetorics. Macedonian Pseudo-Libanios, Pil 2, writing manual of the 9th-10th century, dating back to the epistolary styles of Pseudo-Libanios. The treatise was used primarily as a practical guide to epistolary art. 40 types of letters, Pil 3, writing manual of the 12th, 13th century, containing 40 exemplary letters belonging to 40 epistolary types. Model letters are the result of contamination and rhetorical amplification of the two previous versions, Pil 1 and Pil 2. And the treatise was used both as a practical guide and as a school textbook on epistolography under the theory of rhetorical argumentation. 40 types have survived in two versions, a lengthy and abbreviated versions. Abbreviated version known as Pseudo-Leo, attributed to Leo the Wise. Anonymous Vaticanus A.B. It is preserved in the Manuscript of Vatican. Writing manual compiled earlier in the 15th century, containing 40 samples of 40 letters. The samples of AV are frankly didactic in nature and appeal to the younger generation. The treatise was written and used as a textbook at the early stage of the Byzantine high school. The metaphrase, 40 types of letters, and its modern Greek translation were created in the first half of the 17th century in the Danube principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, the center of Greek education, locating there at the time. The author of the metaphrase not only shortens and simplifies the text of 40 types, but also introduces samples of business-like correspondence. The metaphrase and its modern Greek translation have been used as practical guidelines for writing letters. 40 types and styles of Hellenic letters. That's the name of the writing manuals by Nicodem dating back to the end of the 18th century. That's another transposition of 40 types, the text of which is expanded with the use of quotations from the Bible and patristic literature. The writer was conceived both as a textbook on epistolary art relevant to monastic circles and as a preaching of piety and epistolary form. Byzantine writing manuals were in demand in Western Europe during the Renaissance. In the 16th century, the treatise Epistolary Styles was translated into Latin at least 5 times. Some of these translations are rather free translations of a Greek treatise. John Sambacus revises it in accordance with Latin epistolary theory of the 16th century, adjusting the treatise to the modern needs. Epistolary styles were also used as elementary school textbooks on Ars Epistolandi. We tried to show that the writing manuals belonging to the Pseudo-Libanian tradition were used both as practical aids and as school textbooks. At the same time, the treatise performed another important function, which we called methodological. Epistolary styles provided the theoretical basis for classifying epistolary material and organizing epistolary collections. On the basis of the system developed by Pseudo-Libanios, extensive collections of letters were created, where messages were distributed not according to the author, but according to epistolary types, comforting commendable, offensive letters, and so on. Such collections, known to us since the 15th century, but possibly compiled earlier, show how the Byzantines classify the original letters on the basis of the epistolary theory of Pseudo-Libanios, and testify to the wide popularity and high authority of the theory. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Dmitrii Alexandrovich. Now I would like to ask the members of the Dissertation Council, do you have any questions to the applicant? Questions based on the presentation of the speech? Or you have any questions related to the content of the thesis? Since there are no questions, we may proceed. And I would like to give the floor to the members of the Dissertation Council with their reviews of the thesis. And then the applicant will provide answers to the comments and questions. We have already agreed that he will provide an answer following all the reviews. Am I to say about the external reviews? We haven't received any external reviews, thank you very much. One more remark, please. Since all the reviews were published on the university website with the aim of preliminary getting acquainted with them, I propose not to read the reviews from the beginning to end, but to focus on the questions and remarks. But of course, if you're willing, you can read the entire review, if you wish. Or you can move directly to the summary, ask questions, and give certain comments. Are there any objections? No objections. In such a case, I'd like to give the floor to Tatiana Igorevna Afanasyeva. Tatiana Igorevna, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. The thesis by Dmitrii Chernoglazov, as we can all see and as we heard, is dedicated to a comprehensive study of early Byzantine treatise, epistolary styles, which was widespread not only on the territory of the empire, but on the west during the Renaissance. The treatise attributed to different authors was the focus of the interest of researchers, but it never underwent a comprehensive study. And this gap was filled by Dmitrii Chernoglazov. And the thesis aims to cover all handwritten traditions of the treatise, to identify its changes in certain historical era, to determine the authorship of new editions, the place and time of their creation. The applicant draws on related treatises to epistolary problems and shows a history of the formation of epistolary styles on a wide historical and cultural background, which undoubtedly is being held for the first time. The relevance of the thesis is beyond doubt. The epistolary genre, its developments, theoretical developments, and samples are always relevant, both in the history of Byzantine culture and culture in general. The work consists, as we have heard, of 7 chapters, each of which examines a certain stage in the evolution of the treatise, Pseudo-Libanios. In the introduction, all the previous editions and studies are analysed in details, allowing to see the place of the thesis in the history of the study of this written sample. In the first chapter, the applicant specifies the place and time of the first version of Monument P1 and its sources. To this oldest edition, the author returns in the 7th chapter, where translations made during the Renaissance period are studied. In the second chapter, the author reveals manuscripts in which the revision of the text of the first edition is clearly visible, made in the era of the Macedonian dynasty. It is represented by a large number of lists, each of which is part of the several text groups or editions, as stated in the work. The majority of Pale II samples are systematically amplified. The thesis described in detail the techniques and mechanism of amplification. It is noted that the content of the letters does not fundamentally change. It's important that there is the influence of Christianity, that is the exclusion of mention of pagan gods, ethical Christian elements are introduced, quotes from the Holy Scriptures. In the samples of Pale I, due to their simplicity and the conciseness, they were far from real correspondence. The Pale II serve as templates for writing a real letter. So these are already sample letters, close to epistolary practice. The next revision of the treatise Pseudo-Libanios refers to the late Byzantine era, when the treatise was widely demanded, and as well as the era of Ottoman rule. Pale III is largely complied, using the same text simplification methods as the previous Pale II and Pale I. Nevertheless, it's more secular than Pale II. We can see such concepts as Hellenic religion, as well as love letters. Thus, the epoch of this type of writing manuals is characterized in detail. During the Ottoman Empire, 3 more types of writing manuals emerge. The 4th type is dated according to the historical information which can be seen in the writing manual. That's the beginning of the 17th century in the Danube principalities. The Pale III text in this version is systematically transformed in order to strengthen Christian motives and Christian morality. In previous version of PL, we have the same principle, taboo on scientific specific details and modern realities. Then in PL 4, this rule is violated. Specific historical events are described, and some letter genres are of purely business nature. If previously it was believed that the tradition of the writer Pseudo-Libanios breaks off in the 7th and 6th century, but the thesis convincingly shows continuity between the above-mentioned types of writing manuals and their belonging to one common source. This made it possible to consider the evolution of the epistolary text over a long period of time. We, the readers, see the history of the most important texts in the history of epistolary genre, the writing manual Pseudo-Libanios, in a broad historical perspective. And I would like to say that this is an epic thesis, which pays attention to the most important issues of data and attribution, poetic and dialogical transformation model. Remarks the tradition occupies special scientific review part, and I have only a couple of questions in this respect. Which number of manuscripts was used in the work, and how much this number completely reflects the study? Could attracting new literary works change the situation? Or if the manuscripts used is quite enough to see the entire picture? My second question is linked to my professional interests. In ancient Russia, writing manuals appeared during the Metropolitan Cyprian, 1406, and the earliest copies date back to the beginning of the 15th century. In time, they should be associated with Peel II. During the Paleolog dynasty. According to the Russian tradition, these are mostly sample letters to clergy from metropolitas to episcopus, archbishops, the letter to the great wise men. These are interesting letter samples, and I wonder whether these letters might date back to the Pseudo-Libanios tradition, or they date back to different traditions or to different manuscripts. Finally, I would like to state that the thesis by Dmitrii Alexandrovich is a classical example of comprehensive research work which has a great impact on classical and Byzantine philology. Thus, the thesis on the topic, the treatise Epistolary Styles of Pseudo-Libanios and its later versions, Byzantine letter writing manuals and their practical use, corresponds to the requirements by Order 2016, Order awarding scientific degrees at St. Petersburg State University. And the applicant, Dmitrii Chernoglazov, deserves being awarded the scientific degree of Doctor of Philology, Major 100214, Byzantine and Modern Greek Philology. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Tatiana Igorevna. Since the answers to the questions will be provided later on, I would like to give the floor to Michael Greenbolt. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, this is fine. So thank you very much for inviting me to be present in this very interesting meeting. I just want to summarize my comments that I have sent to the committee and to the university. Dmitrii Chernoglazov combines a set of interesting fields. He combines classical philology, text edition, and textual studies. His dissertation provides new insights into the tradition of instructing letter writing in the High Middle Ages and also in the post-Byzantine period until the 19th century. His dissertation is based on a thorough study and analysis of manuscripts. It was very impressive to see how many manuscripts he used for his investigation. And I think he discovered almost all, and this is a very progress in research that he added a lot of manuscripts to this kind of texts. His work, or in his work, he demonstrated his skills in edition techniques and also in translation techniques. He provides all his texts with translation. This is very important to spread the knowledge of this kind of literature and texts. An interesting element in his study, and I will ask a question at the end, plays the term classic, because Libanios is a classical letter writer in Byzantine times, and he was reused and remodeled during the centuries. And there seems to be some waves in remodeling letters of Libanios during the centuries. So the term classic has to be discussed. Quite interesting was that these letter manuals have been reworked several times. There's one important century, the 10th century, 11th century, the Macedonian Renaissance with a reworking process, and also at the end of the empire. And this is in coherence with new approaches to the educational system, and also the idea of Renaissance is apparent in those periods and centuries. So this is quite interesting, and this is also a great advantage of the study that Dmitrii Chernoglazov tried to give the whole picture of the transmission and tradition of these letter manuals. Also important, and this is for Western medieval history colleagues and philology colleagues very important, that he tried to link this tradition to the Western tradition. In a chapter, he also discusses the Wirkungsgeschichte, so the history of influence of texts in the Western Renaissance, and he provides also a sample of translations of these letter manuals into Latin. And this also demonstrates the impact of this late antique Byzantine tradition in the Western Renaissance period. Very interesting is also the approach concerning the organization of letter collections. Normally we think about collections by one author, but Dmitrii Chernoglazov also offers another idea concerning the classification of letter collections by using such manuals. So certain subjects are combined in a collection, and I think this is a field for future studies as well, to use these letter models to think about the arrangement of collections in the Byzantine and also post-Byzantine period. Another field that can be opened, I think, and this is also, I think, an important element, we can think about Topos modeling. So Dmitrii Chernoglazov provides a lot of material that has been used, reused, but it can also be attached to existing letter collections. So if we take, for instance, a collection of the 14th century, we can check if there are any influences in letter collections of the 14th century by those manuals. And Topos modeling is a data-based, computer data-based tool using statistics. So you count special terms in letter collections, and then you can think about the classification of these letters according to those manuals that have been edited by Dmitrii Chernoglazov. Altogether, I'm very impressed by this study. Again, he combines a lot of sets of philological and textual studies, and I think he fulfills all requirements to get his degree, and he fulfills all requirements on the procedure for awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University, and he deserves the award of the degree of Doctor of Sciences in Philology, scientific speciality 10-14, Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies. Just want to add 3 short questions. So again, the question of classic. What does classic mean? Pseudo-Libanios has been reused because Libanios is a classic name, but there are also important Byzantine letter writers. For instance, Michael Psellos. Michael Psellos was reused by Athanasios Chatsikis in the 13th century as a model. And quite interesting, John Tzetzis, a learned scholar of the 12th century, he served as a model in the late Byzantine period. So can we think about, or can we discuss a little bit about the term classic? What is a classical letter writer in the Byzantine times?
Could you please turn on your video? We can't see you now.
Oh, there's no video anymore.
Yes, there is no video, and we cannot see you.
Okay, maybe I leave the session and re-enter it. A moment, I just end the presentation, and so can you see me now?
No, we
No,
Yes,
but-
yeah, now
yes, now we
it
can
works
see.
again. Yeah,
Perfect, thank
it
you.
works again.
Thank you.
So should I repeat my last
No,
sentences?
no.
or-
We have heard everything, but we haven't seen you. That's the only
Okay, so-
problem. Okay.
I can see myself and I can see myself on the screen again.
Yeah,
it's
so
quite
do
interesting.
we.
Yeah, great. So the first question is the classic. What is a classic? And also, again, the questions: did you find a direct influence in existing letter collections of the late Byzantine period, for instance? And so the traces of this model collections, are they visible in the existing material that has come down to us? Because as we've rightly demonstrated, it has been used in school. What does school mean? This could be another question. Yes, this is my main comment, I think. And there's... Okay, I leave it. Yeah, thank you very much. I stop my presentation and my comments. Thank you very much. You can read the whole commentary, as mentioned before, on the website, and I will not read it again here. I've written it before. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's perfectly clear.
Now I would like to give the floor to Universitetskaya. You have time for your review now. I would like to talk about the novelty of the thesis. And the novelty is based on a range of reasons. Firstly, the topic is linked to a very important problem of the theory of text, the development of Byzantine's epistolography as literary genre, creation of the mechanisms transformation of communicative pragmatic style of writing to literary stereotypes. Secondly, the novelty is determined by the function of the treatise of epistolary etiquette in the practical activity and the process of teaching writing as a type of text. Thus, we can see the dynamics from the theory of writing to practice, and the stages of formation of a very important literally Byzantine genres is established. The chronological range is wide, from the 5th century till the 17th century. The author, for the first time, provides comprehensive philological analysis of the treatise Epistolary Styles, Pseudo-Libanios, using previously non-studied or relatively little studied later versions of the treatise. The sources are identified, and the problems of theory of writing in the historical cultural context are studied. Thus, we can see the reconstruction of epistolary tradition from late antiquity to new era, modern times. And this all determines the novelty of the thesis and its theoretical influence. It is very important to know that the author created the critical publication of one of the treatises akin to PL1, late Byzantine writing manual, 40 types of letters. This edition is of practical value and might be used at university courses and lectures on the theory of text, the basis of Byzantine textology, and so on. The thesis itself is logical, has 7 chapters, solving the tasks stated in the introduction of the thesis. The material of the research is the original version of the treatise Pseudo-Libanios, Macedonian Pseudo-Libanios, and 40 types of letters. We have talked about these materials, which testify the chronological and historiological basis of the thesis. The manuscripts are analyzed taking into account the historiographic traditions, their textology, the personality of the author, the style and the function of the works. Based on historiographic tradition, Dmitrii Alexandrovich identified two types of writing manuals. As a result of their analysis, there is the following confusion. PL1 is at the basis of comprehensive tradition of writing manuals, which has continually existed and developed throughout the entire Byzantine era and even later till the 17th and 18th century. These writing manuals could be called a family. They form the basis of Byzantine epistolary theory. And I believe that this conclusion is a very important one. As for the second type of writing manuals, they are viewed as the guidelines for official letter documents. The author analyzes several collections of letters and says that they were written during the Paleolog era, Ottoman era, and in the modern Greek language. Characterizing the context this way, the author then, in the second chapter, focuses on the sources, dating, and the authorship of the treatise. And it was possible to date back the treatise to the 4th and 5th century. But the lack of specific data about the author shows that it was anonymous. Talking about the structure of the text, the author pays attention to the stylistical homogeneity of the letters, their briefness, no rhetorical additional resources. The subsequent chapters characterize later epistolary collections, which were based on the theoretical base created by Pseudo-Libanios. The third chapter characterizes different editions of the collection. The author talks about the Christianization of the text, reference to the Song of Songs, the Book of Psalms, writings of the Fathers of the Church, and different allusions and quotations of the ancient authors. This event characterizes different cultural traditions during the epoch of Christianization, from Middle Age Scandinavia to post-Kirill Methodius, South Slavia, and the chapters 4 and 7 of the thesis asks the question about the history of the text and important conclusions on manuscript editions, and the continuity and the rhetoric organization of writing manuals is addressed. One of the very important conclusions of the thesis is that originating in the epoch of Hellenistic culture, epistolary genre gradually becomes more democratic, creating rules, recommendations, and becomes the subject of school education. And it gets followers during the Ottoman Empire and during the medieval times in Western Europe. I would like to say a few words concerning the perspective of the research of the typology of epistolary genre in different historically and cultural regions. Dmitrii Chernoglazov gives the definition of a letter from the treatise of Pseudo-Libanios. The letter is a written speech from one absent to one present, serving to a useful goal. My question is, are there any other narrative, not epistolary, literary works of the epoch in question, which would bear the traits of spoken language? And if so, what are the ways to identify spoken word in them? The second comment is linked to my professional scope of interest. The analysis of address formulas led me to address the material which belongs to different territory and historical cultural era, but which nevertheless has certain typological similarities. What I mean is the corpus of birchmark letters of 11th or 15th century. Well, I do understand that Russian epistolography as literary genre emerges with the help of Byzantine influence. But I want to talk about the very beginning of the affirmation of ETK formulas. Alexei Gippius, in the article of 2009, dedicated to ETK formulas of birchmarked letters, said that address formulas such as the letter from X to Y, from X to Y, bows, orders from X to Y, the number of these address formulas is constantly decreasing throughout the whole period of birchmark letters. When the number of greeting formulas increases. Does the author consider that this might be linked to the increase in the use of formulas of characterized type? Can we see such a trend in Byzantine letters? Although we do understand how vastly different these two traditions are and what is the cultural distance between them. Does the applicant think that it is worth comparing birchmarked formulas with late antique private epistolography? Is it possible to find certain typological continuity if we talk about ETK formulas? Finally, I would like to pay attention to the high philological quality of this fundamental research conducted by Dmitrii Chernoglazov and the theoretical importance of the thesis. And we proceed with sacred formulas. The thesis of Dmitrii Alexandrovich Chernoglazov on the topic the treatise Epistolary Styles of Pseudo-Libanios and its later version, Byzantine letter writing manuals and their practical use, corresponds to the requirements, and the applicant Chernoglazov Dmitrii Alexandrovich is to be awarded the scientific degree of Doctor of Philology, Major 100214, Classical Philology, Byzantine and Modern Greek Philology. Points 9 and 11 of the procedure were not violated. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much for your detailed review. I found it very interesting to listen to because I didn't have the opportunity to read it online. Then we move on. I'd like to give the floor to Tatiana Viktorovna Kush. Tatiana Viktorovna, the floor is yours. Dear colleagues, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you pretty well. You can see a lengthy option of my review on the website, and I'd like to give a more concise version of my review. And I would like to agree with the colleagues about the novelty and the importance of the thesis, which have been mentioned by my colleagues. In my review, I paid attention to the aspects which I found most important ones. And, well, I will say a few remarks. The thesis for defense, in my opinion, combines a theoretical approach to such a wide issue of working on the classical samples of the Byzantine epoch and their influence on the subsequent collections. We can see philological and linguistic analysis, as well as historical and cultural analysis. We can see the types of acquisition and reformulation by later authors. As my colleagues have already stated, the author of the thesis talks about the theoretical differences, to see the evolution of epistolary Attica, to see the transformation of rhetorics, see the simplification or the increase in complexity, and also see the influence of this phenomena on Renaissance tradition. Thus, epistolary theory is not static and conservative, which is related to ancient samples. We see a phenomenon which is changing, is extremely complex. The theoretical foundation of the work is comprehensive. Dmitrii Alexandrovich used not only published works, but non-published sources stored in different manuscript collections of archives and libraries. The author used a lot of epistolary corpus of texts, and we can see the letters of very important epistolary writers of Byzantine period and the entire millennium. The sources of Byzantine theory were considered, and the Greek tradition of letter writing was identified and studied. We can see the development of epistolary theory and epistolary Attica throughout the Byzantine period. The author allowed us to see the evolution of theoretical thought, what changes it underwent. The thesis, thus, is a very successful, comprehensive analysis of Byzantine art of letter writing. The author proved that the treatise Epistolary Styles, the Pseudo-Libanios, became the starting point of creating Byzantine writing manuals. The historiography previously said that these writing manuals was the final point, and after it there was nothing created similar. But the author showed us the continuity of the tradition. It is very important to note that the critical edition of anonymous writing manual, 40 types of letters related to the tradition of Pseudo-Libanios, at a very high professional level is of crucial importance. It has translation into Russian and English. The author thus uses the new source, which is of crucial importance as well. The author provides a comprehensive characteristics of the treatise. Dmitrii Alexandrovich also showed the importance, practical importance of theoretical treatises analyzed. They were used as practical manuals to study rhetoric, argumentation, and the letter writing techniques. Their usage as such was very fruitful. We could identify the specifics of school education of letter writings. The context of each manuscript is taken into account. Beg your pardon? The manuscripts were compiled not randomly. It was necessary to take into consideration interpolation and background history and cultural context. The strong point of the thesis was the problem of reception in the literature of Western Renaissance. The author rightly notes that Renaissance West acquires epistolary Byzantine tradition can be seen through the translation of the Greek texts, creation of own writing manuals, and their translation from Greek. The author pays special attention to later Latin translation of the writing manuals of Pseudo-Libanios. It is interesting to pay attention to the adaptation of late scientific treatise into the scientific Western worldview. I would like to give a few comments. Dmitrii Alexandrovich sees two types of writing manuals, and specific paragraphs are dedicated to description of both too, but there is no classification of the letters as such, using the typology of Pseudo-Libanios. It is not clear whether the author agrees with Herbert Hunger on the range of the letters. As for PL2, the author gives a different name. In my opinion, the name might disorient the reader, since the name is linked to the period of Macedonian Renaissance, but Macedonian is very often used as a toponym, thus making the name not very clear. Moreover, the treatise 40 Types of Letters is the late Byzantine writing manual, which is not exactly correct, because the 20th century does not date to that period of the history. The author talks about the archetype of the 12th and 13th century. In my opinion, this dating could be better grounded. There might be sources showing that this writing material emerged before the 12th century. Certain works should be introduced into the list of books of reference. The author didn't give the list of manuscripts, although it would have stressed the volume of work conducted. Nevertheless, the above-mentioned comments are not a disadvantage of the work. I would like to say that the thesis itself is highly original and novel, and I do agree with my colleagues in the idea that Dmitrii Chernoglazov deserves being awarded the scientific degree of Doctor of Philological Sciences, made at 10/02/14. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your attention. Thank you very much, Tatiana Viktorovna. Now, I would like to say a few words myself, which is very difficult. I'm the last speaker, and everything that could be found in my review has already been mentioned. Thus, I will not use the text of my review, but rather summarize and ask a couple of questions, if possible. First of all, it's absolutely clear, as well as other colleagues, I would like to mention that the chronological range is substantial, that the research is interdisciplinary in its essence. We can see textology, philological and historical analysis, and I would like to pay attention to the original philological and textological abstracts, without which such a thesis would not have been of such high quality. And in this work, we can see a lot of such examples, which make it interesting to read. All of the colleagues mentioned the novelty, and I do agree with that. We could see the demonstration of chronological continuity in time and space, west and east, which is a very rare phenomenon when west and east date back to one root. And in here it is the case, and it is clearly demonstrated in the thesis. Very often there is such an idea, while students were taught to write letters, they were taught to do so with the use of this treatise. But later on, this educational practice was abolished, thus this treatise was not in high demand. Otherwise, the letters would have used this treatise. We can see the clear chronological framework. This literary work, Pseudo-Libanios of Pseudo-Libanian style, is valorized. With a new perception, we see how important this work is. The source, which was previously not treated by us in like that, we see the fundamental importance of this work as a writing manual. As for the critical edition, I would like to say that the work conducted is meticulous. It is an example of one of the best modern critical editions of similar kinds. I do like Lachman method, but sometimes I believe that we need to show the entire spectrum of the manuscripts. And very often we might use later types of manuscripts. Very often later works contain at least heuristic material which gives us a new insight on the text. we see not only the key aspects, but additional shades, that is. I would like to say that the work is of fundamental character, and it corresponds to all the requirements to the research works, and the applicant deserves being awarded the scientific degree of Doctor of Philology. Since I'm specializing in antique literature, specializing in prior to a Hellenistic epoch, my question is the following. Maybe it is not even a question, rather a comment, a remark. Is it possible, when you publish a monography, to give an overview of the works when the epistolary science was not formalized, when it was not formalized in school tradition? We can see a lot of school letters of Hellenistic era. We can understand how they were taught and how they performed the task of letter writing. I have this idea that the formalization process and creation of formulas begins at the period of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, and it reaches its peak with epistolary styles of Pseudo-Libanios. Then it subsides, and there is less strictness later on. This is my comment. And now I'd like to give the floor to the applicant, who is to provide the answers to the questions. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the members of the Dissertation Council for your attention to my work and for your high appraisal of my work and for your valuable comments, very interesting questions that I would like to answer. I'll be providing my answers in the order the reviews were presented. To the questions of Tatiana Afanasieva. How many manuscripts were used in the work? In total, more than 80 manuscripts were used. Some of them contain one writing manual version, some contain 2 or 3. Only in a few exceptional cases, we were unable to find a copy of the manuscript in the public access, but limited ourselves to the existing descriptions. Well, sometimes the libraries simply were not interested in providing the material requested for. But the majority of manuscripts were obtained, and I was able to look through them. At least via a good photocopy of them. Next question. Could the use of new lists change the current picture? Well, it's highly likely that I haven't managed to find all the manuscripts that contain the writing manuals. For example, there is a large number of manuscripts stored on Athos, and they are described only superficially. Forming an opinion based on the catalogues is not very easy, and alas, the access to the repositories is difficult. Maybe if I come back here 5 years from now from Athos, I might be able to locate some more manuscripts. Nevertheless, I don't think that new manuscripts would have made a considerable difference. Some manuscripts that I found at the final stage of the work just confirmed my previous hypotheses. Well, and allowed, of course, to make certain corrections. Well, I wouldn't like to say that the work is over. and new manuscripts will be found and located and used. Next, can the samples of the first Russian writing manuals go back to the Pseudo-Libanios tradition, or should we look for Greek samples among the text? Well, I need to say that the first Russian writing manuals, clearly translated from Greek, have nothing to do with any of the versions of Pseudo-Libanios. They go back to another class of Byzantine writing manuals, which are called clerical. And they have the samples of official correspondence and documentation, rather than rhetorical letters of private nature. And quite a lot of such writing manuals have survived, in particular in Petersburg repositories, and most of them haven't been described or classified and nor introduced into scientific circulation. It's substantial work to be done in the future. Therefore, it's still difficult to see which scientific models the first Russian textbooks go back to, but it's a very important task which has to be solved. Next, I'd like to proceed to the review by Professor Grunberg. There were 2 questions in the review. The first, the work of which epistolographic writers could be considered classical. What can we say about the term classic? Which authors can be described as classic, apart from Libanius, that's Vasily the Great, Grigori, and later on Michael Ksell, the author of the 11th century. This is an open question, of course. Which letters created such called gold fund, and which could be characterized as the classical samples for imitation? The second question, can we trace the use of treatise epistolary styles in the late Byzantine epoch? Yes, it is quite possible. We can see the use of certain cliches that can be found in writing manuals. They can be seen in Byzantine letters. And the science is to determine this, how this classification of epistolary letters influenced the collection of epistolary texts. We can say that in the forms of manuscripts there are many collections of letters which, at least partly, are structurized according to epistolary genre or types. It is not always obvious, but often the letters are grouped according to their content, not based on the chronology or on the authorship, but based on the epistolary type. Thus, we can see 10, for example, letters of recommendation, or then 5 other types of letters, and the analysis of such collection is a very important task. Then I'd like to move on to the review by Tatiana Rozdesinskaya. The first question: are there any other narrative besides epistolary works in Byzantine era which has the traces of oral speech, of spoken language? And if so, what are the ways of its location? Such works in Byzantine literature exist. And first of all, these are the lives of saints and some world chronicles, intended for a wide range of readers who may be not well aware of antique literature, who would prefer simplified language. And in these texts, in these lives of saints and so on, you can find both individual replicas of the characters, live dialogues. What are the ways of identifying oral speech? Well, this is a topic of several study. I'd like to note that if any ethicist author who cares about the purity of the ancient Greek language cites a remark or a song in the folk language, the author then emphasizes that he's quoting barbaric common words, thus showing that it might have certain deviation from the norm. It's worth noting that the rhetoric epistolography, despite the definition of writing as written oral speech, is far from the spoken language. Most letters are written in an exquisite or pretentious archaic style. There is such a definition of writing. It is repeated at schools, but strange as it may seem, it is not followed. And this trait is quite characteristic of Byzantine literature. Next question. Is it possible to trace in the Byzantine letters the trends that could be seen in the ancient Russian birch-bark letters? And the comparison of birch-bark formulas with the late antique private epistolography. We know little about the greeting formulas of letters from the Byzantine period, although it might seem strange. The letters were included in the collections as raw models, as samples, as works of rhetorical art. And the formula, so and such greets such and such, in the title of the letters rule, was omitted, since those who collected the letters were interested in the content, not in the formal part. And only starting from about the 15th century, we, at our disposal, have many Greek letters that come down to us in full, with all the formal elements, with the greeting at the very beginning, with a signature at the end. And the signature could be rather lengthy, and the outer inscription on the sealed message to convey to such and such with a bow. Of course, it was written in this way previously, but we simply didn't get those samples. As for Byzantine epistolography, it's difficult to trace any patterns in the evolution of greeting formulas. They are only occasional, but sometimes they were rather lengthy as well. Birch-bark letters should be compared not only with rhetorical Byzantine letters, but with private Greek letters, which have come down to us on papyri and related to the late antique and early Byzantine era. Because in both cases, we talk not about the letters created as the role models of epistolography, but they can be seen as business letters, and it was just a matter of chance that we were able to get them. If we look at the papyrus letters of the 2nd, 5th and 7th century, we can trace the process of gradual complication of the formulas of greetings, wishes, etc. And there are certain works on the topics, and I believe that a comparison of papyrus Greek letters and ancient Russian birch bark letters would be indeed very fruitful and could reveal typological parallels, similarities, or differences. The questions from the reviews by Tatiana Kush on the classification of Byzantine letters proposed by Hunger. The classification proposed by Hunger is harmonious and logical, but its application to specific epistolary material encounters certain difficulties. If we turn to the epistolary heritage of any Byzantine author, Prokopius Galski, Mikhail Pselis, Staphius of Solunsky, so on, we will not be able to find their letters of purely, literally, purely personal, purely business, purely cliché letters. Most of the messages, and which is noted by Hunger himself, are intermediate class of literally personal letters. Literarische Privatbriefe. But with many letters, it will not be successful. Indeed, a letter may be addressed to an official, contain a specific request, but the request will be expressed in an elegant literary form. And the substantial part will be seasoned with abundant expressions and friendly feelings. There are a lot of such samples. Thus, we can see a business-friendly and literally and a cliché letter at the same time. The boundaries between the categories are so blurred that classification turns out to be unproductive. In the same way as, for example, the division of Byzantine historiography into history and monastic chronicles. Many researchers have abandoned such division. In my thesis, I didn't touch upon the classification of Hunger's letters, since I concentrated on the Byzantine epistolary theory, and the division proposed by the Austrian scientist was not familiar to the Byzantines. As for the name Macedonian Pseudo-Libanios, and the fact that this name seems not entirely successful, I would like to say that Professor Grimbert also considered the conventional name Macedonian Pseudo-Libanios not the most successful one, and offered alternative version, Middle Byzantine Pseudo-Libanios. But this is not impeccable as well, since the following version, 40 Types of Letters, is related to the Middle Byzantine era as well, compiled at the end of the 20th century, most possibly. Well, I do understand that there is a certain ambiguity, and the readers might think about a collection of Macedonia, but nevertheless, Macedonian Renaissance is quite an obvious term. But I will think about the name that could be most appropriate for this BL2 collection. Next, it is incorrect to call 40 Types of Letters a treatise of the late Byzantine period. Yes, I do agree. It would be more correct to write that the treatise was compiled at the turn of the Middle Byzantine and Late Byzantine time. I called it Late Byzantine because, having arisen back in the 12th century, it acquired its final or canonical form during the era of the Philology. And the text which emerged in the 20th century was modified. Then, the bibliographic list is missing a number of works that relate to the topics discussed. Of course, well, I'm very familiar with these works, highly familiar with the works. Maybe I should have included them into the bibliographic list. But my task was not to compile a full bibliographic list on Byzantine epistolography. But I will include these works into my monography. Next, in the section Bibliography, there is no list of used manuscripts. In here, I completely agree with the remark. It would be better to include such a list. And as well as written works, I should have used all the other manuscripts. I should have mentioned all the other manuscripts. And to the question by Mikhail Mikhailovich, how was epistolary theory forming in the late antiquity? We don't know about Pseudo-Demetrius before Pseudo-Libanios, that a treatise not belonging to Demetrius, which was created in the first century AD and the 2nd century AD. Well, if we talk about the authorship, we always have pseudo-authors. Pseudo-Leo, Pseudo-Libanios, Pseudo-Demetrius, up until the 17th century, approximately. There is a treatise by Pseudo-Demetrius with fewer letters. We can say that other treatises also existed. Based on the text of Pseudo-Libanios, which pays attention to several points of view of the predecessors. Some say that this is a separate type, others say that this is not a separate type. Thus, we can understand that apart from Pseudo-Demetrius, there were other techniques and other authors. So this might be a process which could be possibly reconstructed with the help of papyri, because based on the papyri we can find some educational letters, school letters, several letters that are named according to the epistolary types and genres. But it's a separate issue how the process was taking place in the late antiquity period. Dear colleagues, I would like to thank all of you once again, and I would like to finish my remarks. Thank you. Dmitrii Alexandrovich, thank you very well. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear colleagues, are you satisfied with the answers provided? Yes, fully satisfied, thank you. I suppose that the answers are absolutely brilliant. Maybe even more interesting than the presentation itself. Now it's time to give the floor to those present in the room. Dear colleagues, from those present in the auditorium, who would like to have the floor? There's nobody willing to speak then. Have you received any questions via email? No, we haven't received any questions via email. It means that everything is perfect. Everybody is content. There are no questions. No requirement for additional information. Dear colleagues, would anyone like to say anything? Any comments, any questions? Then this will be the end of our discussion, and we are not going to receive any more questions via email. Prior to the conclusion and the voting, my question is, do the members of the Dissertation Council and the applicant have any comments or questions on the procedure of the meeting, including related to the remote access mode? And I need to get the answers from each and everyone. The Tatiana Igorevna, do you have any questions, comments, and remarks on the procedure? No. Mr. Grunberg, do you have any questions related to the procedure?
No, everything is fine. The candidate asked and answered all questions, so it's everything is fine and correct. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tatiana Vsevolodovna, I have a question. Do we get a conclusion based on the thesis? Is it a part of the document? No, we don't have such a part of the dissertation as conclusions. We do not discuss the conclusion. We can skip this stage. We don't talk about the formulas, substitutions of the text. So any other questions? No questions. Tatiana Viktorovna, do you have any questions? Comments? No, have no questions and comments. I would like to have a recommendation to the applicant to make a monography as soon as possible and to publish it as soon as possible. The book is almost ready. I have no questions and comments. Me neither, says the applicant.
Переходим к следующему пункту регламента – голосование.
Then we move to the roll call. Now it is. Am I to mention the time? I need to follow the rules of procedure. Prior to the voting, we might mute the sound. Declare the break and discuss the results. Do we need such a break to discuss the results of the defense? Is it necessary for us to have this time for discussion? Tatiana Igorevna, do we need such a break? No, I think we all understand everything similarly. If you have any different opinion, please voice it. No, we all agree that there is no need for a break. So we don't need a break. The time is 4:54 Moscow time. Can you see and hear everybody? The sound is on. Thus we open the roll call. We are to vote on the awarding Dmitrii A. Chernoglazov of the scientific degree Doctor of Philology, Major 100214. Open for roll call. I remind you that the decision of the Dissertation Council the issue of the award of the scientific degree is considered positive if more than half, but at least 3 members of the Dissertation Council participating in the meeting voted for it. Tatiana Igorevna, your opinion, please. I agree that the applicant deserves being awarded the degree. Tatiana Viktorovna deserves being awarded. Tatiana Viktorovna Krush. I vote for. Mikhail Grunbert.
I'm positive as well, yes.
Vielen Dank.
And my personal point of view, I, chairman of the board at Portland Mikhail Mikhailovich, my opinion coincides with the opinions of my colleagues. Thus, dear colleagues and guests, I would like to declare that out of 5 members of the council participating in the vote in the Dissertation Council, 5 people voted for, against none, abstained none. The decision to award Dmitrii Alexandrovich Chernoglazov scientific degree of Doctor of Philology in scientific speciality 100214 Classical Philology, Byzantine Modern Greek Philology accepted. Oh, congratulations to the applicant. And you're given the floor for the final word. First of all, I would like to thank the members of the Dissertation Council for reading my thesis, for high appraisal of my work. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank the philological faculty of St. Petersburg State University and the employees of the department dealing with work of the Dissertation Council, and Irina Vasilievna Alexeyeva in particular, and Kristina Valerievna Maniorova, who helped me to assemble all the documents and work on all the organization procedure. I would also like to thank all my friends and colleagues and the Department of General Linguistics and the Department of Modern Greek and Byzantine Philology, some of whom are present here today. I'm very thankful to my teachers, so to say, who here in St. Petersburg State University taught me ancient Greek, modern Greek and Byzantine literature. I would like to thank Fatima Ilovna, Ivanov Sergei, Dmitrii, Dmitrii, and I owe much to the late who was formerly my scientific advisor, Lubarsky Yakov Nikolaevich, who introduced me into Byzantine philology, and thanks to whom I managed to achieve certain success in this area. And I would also like to sincerely thank my family, my wife, my parents. All of them were readers, keen readers of my thesis, and my wife helped me to edit the text and to improve it. I would like to thank everyone once again. Thank you very much. Well, we'd like to congratulate you again, and we declare the meeting closed. Thank you all for participation.
Прошу отключить прямую трансляцию заседания.